Hello, welcome to Metro Midwives, a Metro midwifery podcast, where we will be talking about issues affecting home birth families, midwives, and midwifery students. I'm Gina Gerbath.
And I'm Nedra Hale, and we are home birth midwives serving the Denver metro area.
So for our first podcast topic, we thought that it would be a good idea to introduce ourselves to you and talk a little bit about what led us along our path to midwifery. And as this journey often does, it involves our own personal birth stories. So we'll talk about our birth stories and how they relate back to our decisions to become midwives and serve the home birth community specifically. So Nedra, why don't you start talking about your first birth experience?
Well, I always like to start way back with my grandmother's births and my mom's births, just because they were such a big influence on my own. And so if you don't mind going back that far.
Definitely.
Okay.
Let's hear it.
So my grandmother gave birth in the 40s and the 50s as an elderly woman of late 30s, early 40s.
Which was a lot less common then.
Yes. She had been told that she couldn't have any children, but that is a long, complicated story. It turned out not to be true. So due to a medical condition that she had, she could not receive anesthesia during her labors. And so she had natural births in the 40s and 50s, which was somewhat unusual depending on where you lived. And my mother then went on to have natural births. We had this kind of philosophy in our family that birth was really not that big of a deal. You just had a baby, and it was...
It's kind of interesting because
Yes.
I was sort of raised with the same scripts in my head.
Oh.
I don't think my grandmother had natural births, but I do think my mom had natural births, and that was just sort of the message that I got over and over, is that this isn't a complication or a medical emergency.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, so we had this just kind of relaxed attitude about birth and why would somebody need to be medicated. I would say when I was in my late teens or so, one of my family members was injured by an epidural, and this also influenced my attitude towards natural birth greatly.
Wow. Tell us about the injury.
It was one of those unusual things that you might hear when you're getting your informed consent for your epidural. And it's something that happens so rarely. So I don't like to focus on it too much, but it can happen. Serious complications can happen. In this case, she was given the medication in the wrong place, is what we understand. It is supposed to be placed in the dural space, and it was placed in her spinal fluid. And she ended up with being anesthetized in her lungs and her brain, and had very severe brain damage. That was many, many years ago, more than 20 years ago now, and she is still in a vegetative state to this day.
That's really tragic.
Yeah. So I walked away from that experience with a little bit of extra fear. Before I had thought birth is just, no big deal. And now I kind of was thinking, wow, I really need to make sure I have a natural birth because I don't want this to happen. So I started doing my research when I became pregnant with my first baby when I was about 22, and actually found out that it might be a little harder than I thought to find a provider that would help me have a natural birth. I was pretty surprised about that. At that time, I didn't really know anything about midwifery or home births. I mean, I knew some home birth families just peripherally, but I was young and it was just something I didn't know much about. So I shopped around for obstetricians. I ended up switching to a different OB practice than I had started with at about 36 weeks at the urging, well, maybe not the urging. I don't want to put that responsibility on her, but my Bradley teacher encouraged me to find my voice about my care. So I switched doctors right at the end and ended up with a practice I really liked at a totally different hospital. And I went on to have a great natural birth in the hospital. And I think what made it awesome is that It was a teaching hospital, which I know some people have horror stories about. But in my case, it was perfection. It was this strange opportunity for this doctor who was not even my doctor. I got the on-call doctor, and he was great. It was perfect. It was an opportunity for him to show the students how to help a woman have a natural birth and deliver over an intact perineum and every last thing I wanted. So
Wow.
it was great.
That is not a typical hospital birth story from 20 years ago.
Right.
My first birth was also in the hospital, and my oldest is just a year and a half older than your oldest, maybe. So they were born really close to the same time. And while it wasn't a bad experience, I certainly didn't feel like it was an experience that all of my wishes and desires were honored. And that being said, that wasn't all on them. Some of that was on me. I didn't prepare myself. I didn't take Bradley classes. I took the hospital classes. And what I've learned through the years is that I'm actually a good patient. And so I didn't really advocate for myself. And so I have to own a lot of that I didn't do a lot to create the experience for myself that I was hoping to get, even though my intention was to have a natural birth. I did have a vaginal birth, but I had an epidural and an episiotomy, which is not done so often anymore, but it was, that was one of the interventions that I did have. So yeah, I would not say it was not similar to your experience, maybe.
So whereas I ended up with, I walked away from my birth feeling extremely empowered and ready to be Wonder Woman and go forth to spread the gospel of natural birth and all of that. How did you walk away from yours?
It was fine. I felt like it was fine. I was not traumatized by it. I was not disappointed, but it wasn't what I wanted it to be.
Okay.
So then when I went to plan my second birth, I knew I wanted something different. Actually, what led me to change my birth plans for my second was that I had a really hard time establishing breastfeeding with my first, and a lot of that had to do with the hospital procedures. So I said that the interventions were an epidural and episiotomy, but also we had immediate cord clamping and separation of mom and baby, no skin to skin, and he was very sleepy, and he got jaundice and needed phototherapy. And so it was just really, really hard getting breastfeeding off to a good start. So I started attending La Leche League meetings when I was pregnant with my second, and had seriously considered planning a home birth early in my pregnancy, or even before I was pregnant, and ended up deciding to plan a hospital birth with a CNM, a nurse midwife. And I interviewed all of the nurse midwives in the Denver area because I wanted to find one who had out-of-hospital birth experience. So at this time, there was no birth center in Denver, so our options were home birth or hospital birth. And I just felt a little fearful because I had had 2 miscarriages between my first and second pregnancies, and then I had trouble conceiving. And I don't know, I think I just had a kind of a crisis of faith in my body and my body's abilities to have a normal pregnancy and a healthy birth. So I ended up picking a nurse midwife that used to practice at home in the home birth setting. And she was great and wonderful, and I loved everything about her. And at 28 weeks, I took my birth plan into her during my regular prenatal appointment. And she's like, yeah, this is awesome. And none of it's going to happen.
Oh, no.
Hospital protocols aren't going to allow me to do this or that.
Oh.
And so it was at that point that I had a really clarifying moment that if I wanted to have the birth experience that I wanted, I needed to plan a home birth. So I switched quite late in care, just like you did, to the hospital practice that supported your own decision making.
Right.
Which is great. So how did your second birth go?
There was a very large space between my first and second babies, so a whole lot of stuff happened in there. As I mentioned, I was, I became a zealot of natural birth. I have relaxed a lot. I still
And
really,
yet we're home birth midwives.
I mean, I still completely believe in natural birth, but I might not talk to people in the grocery store about it, unsolicited. So
instead, we hope that they'll tune into our podcast.
Right, exactly. So, so I went on to become a Bradley teacher myself. I did that for a couple of years. I also became a doula. And I loved working with women in labor. I thought that was just amazing. I did become frustrated with my lack of ability to actually change anything about their experience, though, other than, what you can do with support and advocacy and all that stuff. But in terms of policy, I couldn't really do much. And it pretty quickly led me into wanting to look at midwifery. I had by this time met some midwives and knew more of the people in the community and became a midwifery student in about, I would say, around 2000. And so started going to home births and started at the Arizona School of Midwifery. And so I had a lot of different experiences under my belt by the time I had my second baby. Of course, I had a home birth at that point because I had been exposed to it a lot and I thought it was just completely the way to go. And it was wonderful. I had a giant baby, which was 9 pounds, 3 ounces. So I know some people will laugh at that, but in comparison to my first one, he was really gigantic. But the birth was really straightforward and great. What struck me about it, it wasn't empowering in the same way the first one was, because the first one was so hard. I was laboring with an OP baby, and it was like this like massive achievement of physical strength, to get this baby out. And so
you actually climbed a mountain or
yes,
ran a marathon
yes,
or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The second one, of course, labor is always labor, right? And it's always something that we have to meet with strength, but it was totally different. It was just so relaxed and so straightforward. And then when it was done, I could just stay in my own bed with my baby and establish breastfeeding without any interventions. And it was great. That was on Halloween.
Oh.
And so we actually, we sat in bed for a few hours and then went downstairs and
You went downstairs a few hours
did.
after birth.
You should never do that. That's just...
We would not advise
it's
that.
Inadvisable. But yes, I went downstairs and sat on the couch. So I didn't do any other activity per se, but I did get to watch my daughter go out trick-or-treating, and bring back candy and sit with my baby. And it was just... it's just like we woke up and had a normal day, but we also had a baby in there.
It was a normal special day.
Yes.
What's funny for our listeners is that at that point I had my third baby 2 weeks before she had her second baby. So we were newly postpartum in the same time and not knowing each other,
right.
Of course.
We lived in different states.
Yes. So I guess I would say my second birth is the one that ended up being my empowering birth. Okay. And also in a lot of ways it was my hardest birth. My first birth was long, very, very long. I had a lot of prodromal labor, days of prodromal labor. But once labor was getting into an active pattern, it was really, less than maybe 18 hours from active labor to baby. So not really long for a first baby. No posterior baby, nothing particularly difficult. I was 6 centimeters when I got to the hospital and had a baby 4 or 5 hours after that.
Oh,
so
that's nice.
Yeah. Didn't have to really push a long time. It was all great. My second one, my first home birth, I thought that it would be a lot easier than the first, and it actually turned out that it was, significantly harder without an epidural.
Yes, I can
definitely
imagine.
Felt different. At the end of my first labor, I felt a lot of pressure to push and all those things, and I thought to myself in my head that meant that the epidural was wearing off, and that I wasn't getting much pain relief. Turns out I was getting a lot of pain relief still. And so when I had my second baby, I was like, wow, this hurts a lot more. But that being said, something that's hard isn't necessarily bad. And
Right.
it was that process of overcoming the difficult birth experience that was so empowering, I think.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So his birth was really straightforward. Really not much excitement until he was born. And when he was born, I don't know if it was the adrenaline or what, but I pulled him up. I was on the birth stool, which is also not my favorite place to be. I have lots of thoughts about the birth stool, but it worked. And I think I just pulled him up really too fast or something, and I helped snap his cord. And so there's a little bit of excitement in finding the ends of the cord that was not attached to him anymore. And once we figured that out, everything was fine.
And it's a really great example of something that is a complication that was managed at home.
Yeah, without any incident.
Without incident, yes.
Absolutely. And then, breastfeeding was also not super easy to establish with him, but the patience that the midwives had and the way that they were able to just encourage that skin-to-skin contact and set the stage for success was really different than what happened in the hospital, where there was a lot of intervention and management of trying to get breastfeeding off the ground. So, yeah. So then, let's see. At this point, you're a midwifery student in your birth story?
Yeah, so I have been a midwifery student this whole time, right? And I took some time off a couple of times to have my baby. And by the time I had my third baby, I was very deeply into midwifery school and a very busy apprenticeship. So this was kind of the point where I had decided to push all the way through to licensure. So that was a tough pregnancy in the sense that I was working a lot. We had a very busy practice. We worked with about 100 women a year.
Wow.
And so, but it was so exciting, and I loved it so much. So it was tiring and maybe not the best activity for a pregnant lady. I don't know. Maybe not so much missing sleep. But it was so great, and I learned so much. And I worked with 2 midwives at that time, and they were super supportive. And it was so nice to have my care providers be people I worked with every day, and they took good care of me. So that third birth was interesting in the sense that it was longer than actually longer than both of the ones that came before it.
Interesting.
So
it really was that wild card
yes,
that they
it was
say
the
that
wild
third
card third
be.
birth. But it was so easy. It was just like, it just puttered along for, like 16 hours or something. So it still wasn't incredibly long, but but it was longer. And it was one of those funny stories where you don't want anybody to call the midwife because there's just nothing happening, and the contractions are really spaced. And finally, one of the midwives said, I just feel like I need to come over and check, because it's been so long. And I was 8 centimeters when she got there, so it's a really good thing that she came, and I had the baby shortly thereafter. But it's funny you mentioned the birth stool, because I had been hyper-focused during this pregnancy on birthing on the stool. I really wanted to be upright. And, it was just like the only thing I wanted. And so I sat on the stool, and I hated it so
it's horrible.
much. I just then in my memory, I don't know what it actually looked like, it's on the outside, but in my memory, I'm running around the room trying to find
something else,
a comfortable place, and then finally one of the midwives is like, why don't you just pick a spot and just just stay there and push your baby out, so I did, and I did, and it was fine and wonderful. And
so you didn't get your dream birth stool birth?
No, I did not get my birth stool birth.
Oh, darn.
But and I had a complication that was again managed at home. I had a hemorrhage, and luckily the midwives carry medication and got it totally managed and under control quickly. And so it was a great, wonderful experience. I had my baby had jaundice that time. Also the first time like yours did. So there was some challenge with breastfeeding, but that's not unusual for me.
Yeah. It does not always come easily.
Yes.
So when you mentioned the running around, I think that's, you must have been in transition and just not really aware of where you were at the time.
Yes.
So my third birth was by far my easiest birth. But the problem with my third birth was that my water broke before labor started. And so that was, it was funny because, so with my first, I started feeling pushy and the doctor came in and, well, actually I started pushing with the nurse and then the nurse was like, wait for the doctor. And then the doctor came in and she broke my water and I had a baby. And then my second one, I was kind of like, sounds a lot like your third birth where I really couldn't get comfortable. I was in the tub. They were really pushing fluids on me. So I'd have to get up and pee and then I'd get back in the tub and I'd have to go up the stairs to pee. And I was pretty unsettled. And then I went to, so it's ironic that I ended up on the birth stool because I hated the toilet too. It was super uncomfortable. But anyway, with my, I don't know where I was going with that story, but with my third, my water broke and, that's what I was going to say, my second. Then finally I just said, would you just break my water? And they did. And then I had a baby. So it was like a lot of being unsettled.
Yes.
And I think that bag of water was just kind of holding the baby back. So with my third, my water broke in the morning. I was still nursing my not toddler and he was nursing that morning and I felt this pop and I just, in my head, I'm thinking my water breaks and the baby falls out. So I was really like on high alert and I called my mother-in-law to come get the boys and I called my midwife and let her know that my water had broken. And she said to just, check in with her when things started happening. And we waited and we waited and we waited and really nothing happened all day long. So, of course, the rules are that you have to have a baby at some point after your water break. So my midwife suggested that I take castor oil, which I did, and it worked like a dream. If you want to call castor oil births a dream.
Right. Yeah, that's a good word.
And so from the time I think I took the castor oil at 6, I started having contractions about 9 p.m. and I had a baby by 1 a.m. So it was by far my fastest, easiest birth.
That's great.
Yeah, super, super easy except for the castor oil.
Yes.
Which is, for those that don't know, it works by inducing intestinal distress, and that seems to trigger the uterine contractions, and it all kind of works together to start getting that contraction pattern happening.
Yeah, it releases the prostaglandins. So it works really well.
It works really well.
But it's not always pleasant.
No, it involves a lot of pooping in labor, so that was not fun. But
yes.
So I would say my third. How was your fourth birth?
It was interesting in the sense that just the timing. We hadn't been planning to have a fourth baby, first of all. And there was a lot going on.
Hashtag famous last words.
Right. So there was a big space between the third and the fourth again. And in there, we had found out that my mom had inflammatory breast cancer. We lived in Phoenix at that time, and she lived in Denver. So I actually packed up my house and moved within a space of 2 weeks to get up to Denver. And I left my practice there, which was really sad. But I left it in good hands. I had a great partner at that time, and she, we had students, and they just took it all over with total grace, and it was such a gift. And so we moved up here. And about 3 months after we got here, I'm trying to start a practice in Denver. And then I found out I was pregnant and my mom had cancer. I was just like,
it was the best of times and the worst of times.
But I was, also super excited because I love having babies. It was just like terrible timing, which I'm sure is so common.
Yes.
Yes. So I went through the first year of my practice in Denver, being pregnant and having a baby. And so, a little bit of stress there, but his birth was great. It was 3 hours. And I had a home birth with a midwife that I had, just met a few months before, of course. And so it was kind of bittersweet just because I had my other babies with these people I knew so well. And
we get really attached to our midwives.
and I had to find somebody new. And she went on to become a really good friend. And, so it was a great experience. And it was wonderful having a baby in my late 30s. And I think fourth babies are the best. And he was so easy, and I was so much better at it than I had been before.
So maybe that's what I needed, is to have one more to feel confident.
Yes. It was just, the whole experience was, I definitely recommend being an older mother if you can swing it, because it was so different.
It's, really different. I noticed that with the people that we work with too, that there's a different kind of energy, a different kind of patience, maybe a little more relaxed
kind
attitude.
of let go of the stuff that doesn't matter so much. So
that being said, I am glad that I do not have a little one right now. So
right.
Pros and cons.
Yeah. I've got this ridiculous spread between my children now. So I've got adult children, and I now, have a 7-year-old.
Just a new school-age child. Yeah. Well, I was not a midwifery student for any of my births. I became a La Leche League leader after my second was born. And did really just as I do. I just dove into that head first and was really immersed in the lactation world and breastfeeding peer counseling and having groups and being in administrative positions. And I just did all of the things for that area of my life. And then when my third was about 2.5, my friend asked me to attend her birth. Or she just wanted me to have the experience of seeing another person's birth, because it really is very different when you're not the birthing person. So I attended her birth, and I was just completely, that was it. Like on one hand, I knew this is what I want to do. And on the other hand, I was completely terrified, and I thought that was really scary, and that's a lot of responsibility.
Yes.
And I don't really want to do that, but I have to do it. And so It was really like, for me, I had a crystallizing moment that was very, very clear. And I sort of thought about having a fourth baby, and it didn't happen. So it all seemed like the signs were all pointing to becoming a midwife at that point. So that's what I did. And I started apprenticing when he was about 3.5. I wasn't quite ready right at that point. So I waited about another year and then started apprenticing. And that's kind of how I got started on my way. So I like to say it came from the lactation side. I started with lactation, realized how much we support the natural, how much natural birth supports the process of breastfeeding and establishing breastfeeding. And so then really became a birth advocate because of the impact on breastfeeding it has.
Oh, yes,
so
definitely.
Kind of the back door route, I would say. So, So that is a little bit about us. We hope that you'll join us every week for our little tidbits, or we'll talk about things that are interesting to clients in terms of maybe information about options, information about interventions. We'll talk about teaching for practicing midwives and student midwives. So we're really excited to be here and share a little bit of what we do with you every week.
Yes, it's going to be fun.
Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us today, and have a great week.